The butcher knife trembled in Margaret Garner's hand as she watched the U.S. Marshals splinter the door of Elijah Kite's house with a timber ram. The sound of wood cracking mixed with her husband Robert's pistol shots and the terrified screams of her 4 children huddled on the floor behind her. Through the breaking door, she could see Archibald Gaines, the man who owned her, the man whose children she had been forced to bear, the man whose hands had violated her body for 7 years. He was shouting orders to the Marshals, demanding they retrieve his property before the fugitives could harm themselves. Margaret looked down at her daughter Mary, 2 years old, light-skinned enough that everyone who saw her understood immediately whose child she was. The girl had Gaines's eyes, Gaines's nose, the faded complexion that marked her as the product of rape and the inevitable future victim of the same violation. In 10 years, maybe less, Gaines would come for Mary the way he had come for Margaret. He would force his daughter into his bed because the law said he could, because she was his property, because the children born of rape belonged to their rapist when the mother was enslaved. Margaret had spent 6 hours as a free woman. 6 hours since crossing the frozen Ohio River in the coldest winter in 60 years. 6 hours since she had set foot on free soil and imagined a future where her children would never know the weight of a master's hand. 6 hours of believing that the nightmare of Maplewood Plantation was behind them, that the years of sexual abuse and violence were over, that her daughters would grow up without fear of their master's desires. Now, those 6 hours were ending. The door was giving way under the Marshals' assault. The men with guns and legal authority were seconds from entering. And Margaret had to make a choice that no mother should ever face, a choice between 2 forms of death for her children. She could surrender and watch the Marshals drag her family back across the river to Maplewood, where everything would continue as it had before. She would return to Gaines' bed. Her sons would grow up in bondage, working his fields until their bodies broke. And worst of all, she would have to wait helplessly for the day when Gaines decided Mary was old enough to serve him the way Margaret had been forced to serve him. Or she could save her children from that future, not save them to freedom. That door had closed the moment the slave catchers surrounded Joe Kite's house, but save them from slavery. Save them from rape. Save them from the degradation that awaited them across that frozen river. Save them the only way left available to a mother with no power, no rights, no legal protection, and 30 seconds before capture. The door crashed open. Marshals poured into the room like a flood. Robert's pistol clicked empty. All 6 shots fired. 2 deputies wounded but still standing, the weapon now useless. The men grabbed Robert and his father Simon, wrestling them to the floor. And Margaret Garner, watching her last moment of agency evaporate, made the decision that would define her life, her death, and her memory for generations to come. She grabbed her daughter Mary and pulled her close, whispering, "I love you, baby girl. Mama's so sorry," as she raised the butcher knife that Joe Kite had left on his kitchen table. Mary looked up at her mother with 2-year-old trust, not understanding why Mama was crying, why the loud men were breaking into their hiding place, why everything had gone so terribly wrong. Margaret drew the blade across her daughter's throat in one deep stroke. The wound severed the carotid artery and windpipe. Blood sprayed across Margaret's dress and hands. Mary made a small choking sound and went limp in her mother's arms. The entire act took perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds to kill the child she had carried in her womb, nursed at her breast, protected with every fiber of her being for 2 years. But Margaret wasn't finished. She turned toward her sons Tom and Sam, knife raised, determined to save all her children before the Marshals could stop her. She struck at 6-year-old Tom's head, opening a deep gash. She slashed at 4-year-old Sam's neck, drawing blood. She turned toward infant Scylla, intent on completing her terrible mission of maternal protection. The Marshals seized her then, multiple men restraining a woman who fought with supernatural strength born of desperate love. They pried the bloody knife from her hands. They held her arms while she screamed and struggled, trying to reach her remaining children. And according to every witness who was in that room, Margaret Garner showed no remorse. Instead, she declared that she would rather kill all her children than see them returned to slavery. She said she wished the Marshals had arrived 5 minutes later so she could have finished the job. She said that death was freedom for her babies, and that any mother who truly loved her children would do the same thing. This is the true story of Margaret Garner, documented in Cincinnati court records, newspaper accounts, and testimony that shocked the nation in 1856. This is not fiction. This is not abolitionist propaganda or exaggerated tale-telling. This happened. A mother cut her 2-year-old daughter's throat with a butcher knife rather than allow that child to be returned to slavery. And what that act reveals about slavery's evil is more terrible than most Americans have ever been willing to understand. This is the true story of Margaret Garner, documented in 1856 Cincinnati court transcripts, newspaper archives, and eyewitness testimony from abolitionists, prosecutors, and judges. Every detail in this video comes from authenticated historical records: the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Cincinnati Columbian, trial transcripts preserved in the U.S. District Court, testimony from abolitionist leaders Lucy Stone and Levi Coffin, legal documents from attorneys John Jolliffe and Francis Chambers, and Archibald Gaines's own plantation records. This is not entertainment. This is American history, history that schools rarely teach because it's too uncomfortable, too violent, too morally complex for easy lessons. If you or someone you know needs support, National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233. National Sexual Assault Hotline, 1-800-656-4673. Crisis Text Line, text HOME to 741741. Before we continue, understand that what follows will force you to confront questions about slavery, motherhood, sexual violence, and survival that have no comfortable answers. This story will make you uncomfortable. It should make you uncomfortable. Hit subscribe only if you're prepared for history that doesn't look away from the hardest truths, that doesn't offer easy moral lessons, that doesn't provide redemption or closure. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began, to a plantation in Kentucky where a teenage girl was about to learn that her body belonged to her master in ways that went far beyond labor. Margaret was born into slavery around June 4, 1834, on John Pollard Gaines's plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, 17 miles from Cincinnati across the Ohio River. Her mother's name has been lost to history. The plantation records that meticulously documented every horse, piece of equipment, and bag of seed saw no need to preserve the names of enslaved mothers. Margaret's father may have been John Pollard Gaines himself, based on later descriptions of her as mulatto in census records. But this too is speculation built on the common practice of masters fathering children with enslaved women and then enslaving those children. The first 12 to 15 years of Margaret's life left almost no documentary trace. She existed, she grew, she learned the skills that domestic slaves needed to survive. But the plantation records treated her as they treated livestock, a piece of property whose individual experiences mattered only insofar as they affected her market value and productivity. We know she was described as pretty by multiple sources, which in the context of slavery was not a compliment, but a warning about the particular dangers she would face. When Margaret reached approximately 12 to 15 years old, the plantation records disagree about her exact birth year, because precision about enslaved people's ages was considered unnecessary. She was transferred from John Pollard Gaines's plantation to his brother Archibald K. Gaines's Maplewood plantation. This transfer was not random. Archibald needed additional domestic workers, and Margaret had reached the age when enslaved girls became sexually valuable to their masters. Maplewood Plantation sprawled across several hundred acres of Kentucky farmland in Richwood, Boone County. The main house was a substantial two-story structure, painted white, with columns that proclaimed the wealth slavery generated. Behind the main house stood separate structures. The kitchen building where enslaved women cooked meals over open fires in sweltering heat. The quarters where enslaved people lived in conditions that ranged from barely adequate to squalid. The tobacco-curing barns where the plantation's cash crop was processed, and various outbuildings for equipment and supplies. Margaret's duties at Maplewood were those of a domestic slave, what plantation records euphemistically called a house servant, as if the work involved voluntary service rather than forced labor backed by violence. She cooked meals for the Gaines family, spending hours in the separate kitchen building that kept the main house cool by isolating the cooking fires. She cleaned the white family's living spaces, washing floors, beating carpets, polishing furniture, emptying chamber pots, changing linens. She did laundry by hand, heating water over fires, scrubbing clothes against washboards until her hands bled, hanging everything to dry regardless of weather. She sewed and mended clothing for the entire household. She may have served as wet nurse for Elizabeth Gaines's children, a role that would have required Margaret to abandon nursing her own infants in favor of feeding her mistress's babies. The work was exhausting and endless, but it was not the worst aspect of Margaret's life at Maplewood. Archibald K. Gaines was in his 40s when Margaret entered his household, married to Elizabeth, father to legitimate white children, who would inherit his property and social position. He was known among neighbors as a man of violent temper who maintained discipline on his plantation through physical punishment. The scars on Margaret's face, which multiple trial witnesses would later document, testified to beatings she had endured, whether from Gaines himself or from Elizabeth Gaines, who would have understood exactly what her husband was doing to the teenage girl in their household. When Margaret was somewhere between 15 and 17 years old, she married Robert Garner, an enslaved man who belonged to James Marshall on a neighboring plantation approximately 1 1/4 miles from Maplewood. Robert was described as very dark complexion in later court testimony, tall and strong, a field hand whose work involved heavy agricultural labor. The marriage between Margaret and Robert was what slavery called an abroad marriage. They lived on separate plantations and could visit each other only when their respective masters permitted such visits, typically on weekends or holidays. Abroad, marriages served multiple purposes within the slavery system. They prevented enslaved couples from forming the deep bonds that might lead to coordinated resistance. They allowed masters to control reproduction by limiting when husbands could access their wives. And crucially, they provided plausible deniability about paternity when enslaved women became pregnant during periods when their husbands were absent or had limited access to them. In 1850, when Margaret was approximately 16 years old, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Thomas. The baby had dark skin similar to Robert's complexion, and there was no question about his paternity. Tom, as the family called him, was Robert and Margaret's son. conceived during one of Robert's permitted visits to Maplewood. For a brief time, Margaret may have experienced the joy that new motherhood should bring, though that joy would have been tempered by the knowledge that Tom belonged not to her, but to Archibald Gaines, who could sell the baby away from his mother at any moment if it suited his economic interests, or if he wanted to punish Margaret for some perceived disobedience. In 1852, Margaret gave birth to her second son, Samuel. Sam also had dark complexion, consistent with Robert's paternity, but it was becoming clear to Margaret that Archibald Gaines had decided her body would serve purposes beyond domestic labor. The pattern of her pregnancies, the timing, the circumstances, the periods when Robert was hired out to work elsewhere for extended periods, tells the story that plantation records hide behind numbers and categories. In 1854, Margaret gave birth to a daughter named Mary. The baby had noticeably lighter skin than her older brothers, what witnesses at Margaret's later trial would delicately describe as a faded complexion or nearly white appearance. And in 1855, Margaret gave birth to another daughter, an infant who would be called Scylla or Priscilla, whose complexion was even lighter than Mary's. The light skin of Margaret's younger children was evidence that everyone could see, but polite society refused to acknowledge directly. Archibald Gaines had fathered these children through sexual assault. The timing of the pregnancies corresponded precisely with periods when Elizabeth Gaines was pregnant herself and would have refused sexual relations with her husband, according to Victorian customs. Margaret's pregnancies also occurred when Robert was hired out to other plantations and had no access to his wife for months at a time. Historian Nikki M. Taylor, who conducted the most thorough research into Margaret's life, documented this pattern through plantation records and trial testimony. Archibald Gaines was the only white male living at Maplewood during the periods when Margaret conceived Mary and Scylla. The regularity of Margaret's pregnancies, approximately every 2 years, suggests repeated sexual encounters rather than isolated incidents. And the progression from dark-skinned children when Robert had access to Margaret to light-skinned children when Robert was absent creates a timeline that amounts to documented evidence of systematic rape. The law did not recognize what Gaines was doing as rape. Under Kentucky slave codes, enslaved women had no legal right to refuse their masters' sexual demands. Masters had absolute power over enslaved people's bodies, and that power explicitly included sexual access. Enslaved women could not testify against white men in court, could not bring charges of assault, could not seek protection from any legal authority. If a master chose to rape an enslaved woman, that was his legal right as a property owner doing what he wished with his property. Elizabeth Gaines would have understood exactly what was happening. Plantation mistresses lived in intimate proximity to their husbands' sexual violence against enslaved women, and they dealt with that knowledge in various ways. Some pretended not to notice, maintaining the fiction that their marriages were respectable. Others directed their fury at the enslaved women rather than at their guilty husbands, punishing the victims for their own victimization. Elizabeth Gaines may have been the source of some of Margaret's scars, taking out her rage and humiliation on the teenage girl who bore her husband's mixed-race children, while Elizabeth bore his legitimate white heirs. For Margaret, each pregnancy meant approximately 9 months of physical suffering, followed by the trauma of childbirth, under conditions that killed thousands of enslaved women annually. It meant enduring her mistress's fury and her master's continued assaults, even while pregnant. It meant nursing babies while trying to maintain her domestic duties, knowing that either task could result in punishment if not performed to her owner's satisfaction. And worst of all, it meant looking at her daughter's light complexions and understanding with terrible clarity what future awaited them. Mary was born in 1854. By 1856, she was 2 years old, a toddler who played with her brothers, who called for her mother, who had no understanding of the horror that awaited her in another decade. But Margaret understood. Margaret had lived through the progression from childhood to puberty to sexual exploitation. She knew that when Mary reached approximately 12 to 15 years old, the age Margaret had been when Archibald Gaines first raped her, Gaines would begin assaulting his own daughter. The fact that Mary was his child would not protect her. It might even make her more vulnerable, as Gaines would have total control over her, with no need to even pay another master for access to her body. This was the future Margaret could see with absolute certainty. Mary growing up at Maplewood, learning domestic skills, reaching puberty, catching Gaines' attention as Margaret once had, enduring the same violations in the same household, bearing her own father's children, who would be enslaved like their mother. And then Scylla would follow the same path a few years later. And if those girls bore daughters, the cycle would continue through another generation. Slavery destroyed families through sale and separation, but it also destroyed families through systematic sexual violence that made fathers into their daughters' rapists and mothers into powerless witnesses to their children's abuse. Daily life at Maplewood meant navigating this horror while performing the endless labor that domestic slavery required. Margaret woke before dawn to start fires, prepare breakfast, wake the Gaines family, serve their meal, clean up after them, begin the day's washing or sewing or cooking or whatever task was demanded. She worked until late at night, with brief breaks to nurse her infant and check on her other children. She endured Gaines's assaults whenever he decided to assert his power over her body. She endured Elizabeth's rage when that rage needed an outlet. She endured the isolation of a broad marriage, seeing her husband Robert only when the masters permitted visits, unable to build the kind of intimate partnership that sustained free couples through hardship. And she watched her children grow. Tom, age 6 by early 1856, was old enough to start being assigned light labor tasks. In a few more years, he would be working full days in the fields, his childhood ended by slavery's demand for profit. Sam, age 4, would follow his brother into field labor soon enough. Infant Scylla, not yet a year old, had her entire life of slavery stretching before her. And Mary, pretty, light-skinned Mary, who looked more like Gaines than like Margaret, carried her future abuse written on her face for anyone to see. By late 1855, Margaret and Robert had begun making plans to escape. The decision to run away with 4 small children, including an infant, was nearly insane. The odds of success were vanishingly small, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. But staying meant accepting the future that Maplewood represented. Staying meant watching Tom and Sam worked to death in tobacco fields. Staying meant Margaret's continued rape. Staying meant Mary and Scylla facing the same violation in a decade or less. And Robert, visiting his family on weekends and holidays, had to endure the knowledge that his wife was being raped by their master and that he was powerless to protect her or punish Gaines. The winter of 1856 was the coldest in 60 years, cold enough that the Ohio River began to freeze solid. Robert made contact with the Underground Railroad network in Cincinnati through intermediaries who could travel across the river without attracting suspicion. A plan began to take shape. They would wait for the river to freeze completely solid, creating a natural bridge to freedom. They would coordinate with other enslaved people on the Gaines and Marshall plantations to escape together. Safety in numbers, mutual support, shared risk. and they would make their attempt on a Sunday night, when masters were less vigilant because they assumed enslaved people would be too religious or too afraid to run away on the Sabbath. The plan required patience and secrecy. Any hint that enslaved people were contemplating escape would result in increased surveillance, separation of families, brutal punishment to terrorize others out of similar thoughts. Margaret and Robert had to behave normally, performing their duties without any sign of the desperate hope building inside them. They had to watch the weather, waiting for temperatures to drop low enough for long enough to make the river crossable. And they had to believe, against all evidence and experience, that freedom was possible, that the nightmare could end, that their children might grow up without masters. On Sunday night, January 27, 1856, the temperature in northern Kentucky dropped to the lowest point it had reached all winter. The Ohio River had been frozen for days, thick enough that locals were walking across it to Cincinnati, treating the ice as a temporary bridge. Robert Garner knew this might be their only chance. If the weather warmed even slightly, the ice would thin and become impassable. Around 10:12 p.m., 17 enslaved people gathered in the darkness near the Gaines and Marshall plantations. Robert and Margaret brought their 4 children, 6-year-old Tom, 4-year-old Sam, 2-year-old Mary, and 9-month-old infant Scylla. Margaret was approximately 6 months pregnant with her 5th child, her belly swelling beneath the layers of clothing she wore against the cold. Robert's parents, Simon and Mary Garner, joined the escape along with 9 other enslaved people from neighboring properties who had decided to risk everything for freedom. Robert had stolen his master's horses and sleigh earlier in the evening, hiding them near the river. The group piled into the sled in darkness so complete that they could barely see each other's faces. Robert drove the horses through back roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares where patrols might spot them. The sleigh runners cut through snow as the horses pulled their cargo of desperate people toward the river, each mile taking them closer to either freedom or disaster. They reached the Kentucky riverbank around 8:00 a.m. on Monday morning, January 28th. Dawn was breaking, pale winter light revealing the expanse of frozen river stretching before them. The horses, recognizing the danger, would go no farther. Robert abandoned the animals and sleigh at the shore, evidence that would make their escape immediately obvious once discovered. But there was no alternative. The group proceeded on foot across the ice. The crossing was terrifying beyond description. The ice groaned and cracked under their weight, making sounds like rifle shots that echoed across the frozen expanse. In places, the ice was clear enough to see the dark water flowing beneath, a reminder that breaking through meant death within minutes from hypothermia. Margaret, pregnant and carrying infant Scylla, struggled to keep her footing on the slippery surface. 2-year-old Mary whimpered with cold and fear. Tom and Sam, old enough to understand some of what was happening, stayed quiet as their parents had instructed, but their eyes were wide with terror. The wind off the river cut through inadequate clothing. None of them were dressed for the journey. Enslaved people rarely had winter clothing sufficient for prolonged exposure, and wearing unusually warm clothes before the escape would have attracted suspicion. Their feet, in worn shoes or wrapped in rags, were going numb. Their hands, gripping children or steadying other escapees, were freezing. And all of them knew that discovery meant either drowning in the icy river if they broke through, or being caught and dragged back across the ice to face punishment that would be designed to terrorize every other enslaved person who witnessed it or heard about it. But they made it. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on Monday, January 28, 1856, Margaret Garner stepped onto Ohio soil for the first time in her life. She was free. Her children were free. The state she stood in had abolished slavery, and under the law of that state, She and her family were free people rather than property. The journey from slavery to freedom had taken perhaps 40 minutes of walking across a frozen river, but it represented the end of generations of bondage and the beginning of lives they would control. The 17 fugitives split up immediately upon reaching the Ohio shore. 9 of them, following Underground Railroad protocols, headed directly for safe houses that had been arranged in advance by Cincinnati abolitionists. These 9 would move through the city quickly, rest during daylight in hiding places, then continue north toward Canada after nightfall. Their names have been lost to history, but they escaped successfully and were never recaptured. Robert and Margaret, burdened with 4 small children including a nursing infant, could not move quickly enough to reach the safe houses before full daylight. Instead, they headed for the home of Elijah Kite. Some records call him Joe Kite, Margaret's cousin, who had been born enslaved on the Gaines plantation, but had been purchased to freedom by his father years earlier. Kite was a free black man living in Cincinnati's Mill Creek neighborhood, in a modest house below the main part of the city. He knew Margaret's family and could be trusted to provide temporary shelter. But finding Kite's house in an unfamiliar city, in daylight, with exhausted and cold children, required asking directions from people on the streets. Each person they asked became a potential witness who could later tell slave catchers which direction the fugitives had gone. The trail of questions and answers created a path that pursuers would follow within hours. The Garner family reached Kite's house around 9:00 a.m. They stumbled inside, desperate for warmth and rest. Kite immediately understood the danger they were in. Cincinnati might be a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave slave owners the right to pursue escaped slaves across state lines, with federal marshals assisting them. Kite sent word to Levi Coffin, the prominent Quaker abolitionist known as the president of the Underground Railroad, asking for help moving the family to safer hiding places west of the city. Coffin sent word back advising the Garners to stay hidden during the day and prepare to move after nightfall. In the meantime, Coffin would arrange transportation and safe houses that could accommodate a family with 4 small children. The plan made sense. Traveling during daylight would be too risky. Better to rest and travel under cover of darkness. But the plan assumed they had until evening. They did not. Back across the river in Kentucky, the escape had been discovered at first light when the abandoned horses and sleigh were found at the riverbank. Archibald Gaines and John Gaines, discovering 9 of their enslaved people missing, reacted with the fury of property owners who had been robbed. They immediately organized a pursuit party and sent riders across the frozen river with authority granted by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The posse consisted of both Gaines brothers, several hired slave catchers, who made their living tracking down fugitives, U.S. deputy marshals, whose federal authority gave them jurisdiction even in free states, and Cincinnati police officers, who were required by federal law to assist in capturing escaped slaves. The group numbered approximately 24 armed men with full legal backing. The fugitives had left a trail that was easy to follow, witnesses who had seen them crossing the ice, people who had given them directions to Kite's house. By late morning, the posse had tracked the Garners to Kite's address. They surrounded the small house, cutting off any possibility of escape through windows or back exits. Inside, Robert Garner heard the men gathering outside and understood immediately what was happening. Through the window, he could see Archibald Gaines directing the operation, pointing at the house, giving orders to the marshals and slave catchers. The sight of Gaines triggered something in Robert. This was the man who had raped his wife repeatedly, who had fathered children on Margaret, while Robert was forced to watch his family destroyed by sexual violence he was powerless to prevent. Robert had stolen a pistol from the Gaines plantation during their escape, a 6-shot revolver that he had hidden beneath his coat. He had not known whether he would need to use it, had hoped that reaching Ohio would be enough, that free soil would provide the protection the law promised. But seeing Gaines outside, seeing the Marshals preparing to force entry, Robert made a decision. He would not surrender. He would not watch his family dragged back across the river without resistance. If they were going to take his wife and children back to slavery, they would have to do it over his dead body. Robert barricaded the front door with furniture, while his father Simon and Joe Kite helped reinforce the windows. Margaret gathered the children into the back room, trying to calm them as the noise outside grew louder. Men shouting, horses moving, weapons being checked. The children were crying with exhaustion and fear. They had been traveling for over 12 hours, had crossed a frozen river in darkness, were cold and hungry, and terrified by the violence they could sense building around them. The posse gave the fugitives a few minutes to surrender voluntarily. A U.S. Marshal called out, identifying himself and demanding that the occupants come out peacefully. When no response came from inside the house, the Marshal announced that they would force entry, that resistance was futile, that the fugitives would be returned to their lawful owners, whether they surrendered or not. Robert positioned himself at a window and fired through the glass, the pistol crack impossibly loud in the small house. Outside, Deputy Marshal John Patterson clutched his arm as blood spread through his sleeve, a flesh wound that would not be fatal, but that demonstrated the fugitives' willingness to use lethal force. The posse responded by attacking the door with a timber ram, the heavy beam smashing against the barrier Robert had constructed. The sound of wood splintering filled the house. Robert fired again through the breaking door, hitting another deputy marshal in the face with shot that left painful but not life-threatening wounds. The marshals kept battering the door, and with each blow, the barrier weakened. Robert could hear them shouting that they were coming in, that resistance would only make the punishment worse, that he should give up before someone got killed. In the back room, Margaret clutched her children and watched the front door fail. She could see through the doorway as the marshal's timber finally split the barrier, as armed men began forcing their way into the house. She could hear Robert fire his pistol again. That would be 4 shots, leaving 2 rounds left. She watched as the marshals grabbed Robert and his father, wrestling them to the floor, disarming them despite their struggles. And Margaret Garner understood that it was over. 6 hours of freedom had come to an end. The marshals were in the house. Archibald Gaines would take custody of his property within seconds. They would be dragged back across the frozen river to Maplewood, where the punishment for running away would be severe enough to terrorize every other enslaved person who heard about it. Robert would be sold away, probably to the Deep South, to ensure he could never see his family again. Margaret would return to Gaines's bed, would endure both his sexual assaults and Elizabeth's fury. Tom and Sam would grow up knowing they had been free for 6 hours, and then lost everything. And Mary, pretty, light-skinned Mary, would grow up at Maplewood, and in another decade would face the same violation her mother had endured. That future was intolerable. Margaret had crossed a frozen river in darkness to escape it. She had risked drowning, had risked capture, had risked everything, because she believed her children deserved better. And now, with marshals in the house and Gaines outside waiting to reclaim his property, Margaret had perhaps 15 seconds to save her children from that future. Not save them to freedom. That was impossible now. Save them from slavery. Save them from the degradation and violence and sexual abuse that awaited them. Save them the only way a mother could when the law gave her no power and no rights and no protection. On Joe Kite's kitchen table lay a butcher knife. Margaret grabbed it. She looked at her children, Tom, Sam, Mary, and infant Scylla. And in that moment, she made a choice that would define her forever. She seized Mary first, pulling the 2-year-old close. Mary reached for her mother, trusting, not understanding why Mama was crying, why everything was chaos and violence. Margaret drew the blade across her daughter's throat in one deep, certain stroke. The knife cut through skin and muscle and cartilage, severing the carotid artery and the windpipe. Blood sprayed across Margaret's face and dress, across the floor, across the table. Mary made a small gurgling sound and went limp in her mother's arms, her blood pumping out in rhythmic spurts that matched her failing heartbeat. The entire act took perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds to kill the child she had carried in her womb, nursed at her breast, sung to sleep every night for 2 years. Margaret dropped Mary's body and turned toward Tom and Sam, with the knife raised. 6-year-old Tom saw his mother coming, saw the blood on her hands and the wild determination in her eyes, and he screamed and tried to run. Margaret caught him and struck at his head with the knife, opening a gash above his left eye that bled profusely. She turned to Sam, slashing at his neck and opening a wound that would scar him for life, but that narrowly missed the major blood vessels. She grabbed a shovel leaning against the wall and turned toward infant Scylla, intent on completing her mission of terrible love. If she could kill all 4 children before the Marshals stopped her, at least they would all die free rather than live as slaves. At least they would never know the degradation she had endured. At least, the Marshals seized her then. Multiple men restrained Margaret, holding her arms and prying the weapons from her hands while she screamed and fought with inhuman strength. They dragged her away from Scylla, away from her surviving children, holding her while she cursed them and wept and declared that she had done the right thing, that she would do it again if given the chance, that death was better than slavery for her babies. On the floor lay Mary Garner's small body, a 2-year-old child whose throat had been cut by her own mother. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the rough floorboards of Joe Kite's house. Tom and Sam bled from their wounds, crying for their mother, who had just tried to kill them. Infant Scylla, miraculously untouched except for the blow from the shovel that had stunned her but caused no serious injury, wailed in confusion and fear, and Margaret Garner, covered in her daughter's blood, showed no remorse. According to every witness who was present, Margaret declared that she would rather kill her children than see them returned to slavery. She said she wished the Marshals had arrived 5 minutes later so she could have finished what she started. She said that Mary was better off dead than enslaved, that she had saved her daughter from a future of rape and degradation, that any mother who truly loved her children would do the same. The Cincinnati Daily Gazette would report the next day. The mother had evidently been determined to murder all the children and then destroy her own life rather than return to slavery. With one hand she held a knife, in the other she held the throat of a little girl, aged 2 years and a half. The throat of the child was cut entirely across, and the blood was gushing from the wound. Margaret Garner had committed infanticide, and she had done so believing it was an act of love, the only form of protection she could offer her daughter when every other form of protection had been stripped away by slavery's evil. News of the infanticide spread through Cincinnati within hours, creating a firestorm of reaction that would make Margaret Garner's case the most notorious fugitive slave hearing of the entire antebellum era. By afternoon on January 28th, crowds were gathering outside the county jail, where the Garners were being held. By evening, thousands of people filled the streets around the courthouse, arguing about what Margaret's act meant and what should be done with her. The legal questions were unprecedented in their complexity. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, escaped slaves were to be returned to their owners through federal hearings before U.S. commissioners, with no right to jury trial and no ability to testify on their own behalf. The law treated fugitive slave cases as simple property disputes. The owner would present documentation proving ownership. The alleged fugitive would be denied any opportunity to contest that evidence, and the commissioner would order their return within days. But Margaret Garner had committed May murder on Ohio soil. The state of Ohio had abolished slavery and maintained criminal jurisdiction over all crimes committed within its borders. If Margaret had killed her daughter, she had done so as a free person in a free state, and Ohio had the right, indeed, the obligation, to prosecute that murder under state law. This created a direct conflict between federal fugitive slave law and state criminal law. If Ohio prosecutors charged Margaret with murder, she would be held in state custody to stand trial, which would prevent her return to Kentucky under federal law. But if federal authorities insisted that fugitive slave proceedings took precedence, Margaret would be returned to Kentucky before Ohio could prosecute her, effectively allowing Archibald Gaines to prevent his slave from facing murder charges simply by asserting his property rights. The political implications were explosive. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was already the most hated law in the North, seen by abolitionists as federal government enforcement of slavery in states that had abolished the institution. If federal law could prevent a state from prosecuting murder simply because the murderer was claimed as a slave, it would demonstrate that slavery trumped state sovereignty on every issue. Northern states would effectively become extensions of the slave system, unable to enforce their own criminal laws against people claimed as Southern property. The abolitionist community in Cincinnati immediately mobilized to defend Margaret. John Jolliffe, an attorney with extensive experience defending fugitive slaves, agreed to represent the Garner family. Pro bono. Jolliffe was 52 years old, a native Virginian who had moved to Ohio specifically because he opposed slavery, a man with deep religious convictions that slavery was sin and that defending fugitives was God's work. He was joined by Samuel Gitchell, another abolitionist attorney, and by informal advisors including Levi Coffin and other Underground Railroad operators. Archibald Gaines hired Francis T. Chambers, a prominent Cincinnati attorney, to represent his property interests. John W. Finnell, the U.S. District Attorney from Kentucky, also joined the prosecution team, bringing federal authority to the proceedings. The legal talent on both sides was formidable, which guaranteed that the hearing would not be the brief formality that typical fugitive slave cases involved. The hearing began on January 29, 1856, just one day after the killing, before U.S. Commissioner John L. Penderry. Penderry was a political appointee whose sympathies lay with the South, but who was also aware that the entire nation was watching his courtroom. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans were sending correspondents to cover the trial. The courtroom itself could hold perhaps 200 people, but thousands more packed the streets outside, waiting for news of each day's proceedings. The defense's first strategy was to challenge whether the Garners were fugitive slaves at all. Jolliffe presented witnesses who testified that Margaret had been brought to Cincinnati by her owners on previous occasions to work as a nurse for relatives of the Gaines family. Under legal precedent, established in several northern states before the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, enslaved people who were voluntarily brought into free states by their masters became legally free through that act. If this precedent applied to Margaret, she was not a fugitive slave, but a free woman who had been illegally held in bondage in Kentucky. The testimony on this point was extensive. Multiple witnesses testified they had seen Margaret in Cincinnati at various times, working in homes of Gaines' family members. The defense argued that these visits constituted residence in free territory that had legally freed Margaret, and that all her children, having been born after these visits, were likewise free because they followed the condition of their mother. Archibald Gaines and Elizabeth Gaines both testified that Margaret had never been taken to Cincinnati, except for brief visits to the riverbank that did not constitute residence in Ohio. They claimed that any time Margaret was seen in Cincinnati, it was without their knowledge or permission, that she had come on her own without authority. The factual dispute was difficult to resolve because enslaved people's movements were not documented with the precision that would allow definitive proof either way. Commissioner Pendery listened to this testimony with growing frustration. The legal questions were complex, the witnesses contradicted each other, and the crowds outside were becoming more aggressive as the days passed. He eventually ruled that even if Margaret had been brought to Ohio on previous occasions, her return to Kentucky and continued service there constituted a voluntary return to slavery that reattached her enslaved status. The precedent about enslaved people becoming free through residence in free states did not apply if they returned to slavery voluntarily afterward. This ruling was legally defensible under some interpretations of pre-1850 law, but it created a logical absurdity. How could an enslaved person voluntarily return to slavery when refusing to return would be legally impossible? The ruling essentially meant that masters could take enslaved people into free states temporarily without risking their property rights, as long as they brought them back to slave states afterward. It was a pro-slavery interpretation that prioritized property rights over human freedom. With the residence argument defeated, the defense moved to their second strategy, demanding that Margaret be charged with murder in Ohio state court and held in state custody rather than federal custody. Ohio prosecutors cooperated by obtaining a murder indictment from a Hamilton County grand jury. Sheriff Gazaway Brashears received a writ of habeas corpus ordering U.S. Marshal Hiram Robinson to deliver Margaret to state custody so she could be tried for murder. This created the central legal fight of the entire case. Did federal fugitive slave law take precedence over state criminal prosecution? Could a commissioner return a fugitive slave to her owner even if the state where she was captured wanted to prosecute her for murder? The arguments on this question consumed days of testimony and legal briefing. John Jolliffe argued that Ohio's sovereignty included the right to enforce its criminal laws against anyone who committed crimes within its borders, regardless of that person's status under federal fugitive slave law. He cited constitutional provisions about state police powers and argued that allowing federal law to prevent state murder prosecutions would effectively immunize fugitive slaves from criminal liability for anything they did while escaping. Francis Chambers, representing Gaines, argued that the Fugitive Slave Act explicitly gave federal commissioners jurisdiction over fugitive slave cases, and that this jurisdiction superseded state criminal prosecutions. He pointed to the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution and argued that federal law trumped state law, where the two conflicted. More provocatively, he argued that if every free state could prevent enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act simply by indicting escaped slaves for crimes, the federal law would become meaningless and the Union would effectively dissolve because Southern states would never tolerate such nullification of their property rights. The political context of this argument was the sectional crisis that was already pushing the nation toward civil war. Southern states were threatening secession if Northern states continued to obstruct enforcement of fugitive slave laws. The Margaret Garner case became a proxy for the larger question of whether slavery would control federal law, or whether free states could maintain some independence from the slave system. As the legal arguments continued, the courtroom itself became the site of dramatic testimony that would shape how the nation understood Margaret's case. Lucy Stone, already famous as a pioneer of women's rights and a committed abolitionist, attended the trial daily and sought permission to testify. Stone was 37 years old, had been lecturing on women's rights and abolition for over a decade, was married to Henry Blackwell, and had kept her own name after marriage in defiance of convention, an act that was so radical in 1856 that women who followed her example were called Lucy Stoners. Stone had followed the Garner case from the moment news broke, recognizing that Margaret's story illuminated aspects of slavery that male abolitionists often overlooked or minimized: the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the destruction of maternal bonds, the impossible choices that slavery forced on mothers who wanted to protect their children. Frances Chambers objected strenuously to Stone's testimony, arguing that she had no direct knowledge of the case and that she had improperly attempted to influence Margaret by visiting her in jail. But Commissioner Pendary allowed Stone to speak, and what she said would resonate for generations. Stone addressed the packed courtroom directly, her voice clear and unwavering despite the hostile glares from pro-slavery observers. She looked at Margaret Garner, sitting in the defendant's area, then at Archibald Gaines, then at Tom and Sam with their bandaged wounds. And she spoke the truth that Victorian propriety demanded remain hidden. The faded faces of the Negro children tell too plainly to what degradation female slaves submit. Rather than give her little daughter to that life, she killed it. If in her deep maternal love she felt the impulse to send her child back to God, to save it from coming woe, who shall say she had no right to do so? The phrase faded faces was Victorian euphemism for light skin that indicated white paternity. The word degradation was euphemism for rape. The phrase that life meant sexual exploitation. But everyone in the courtroom understood exactly what Stone was saying. Archibald Gaines had raped Margaret Garner repeatedly, had fathered Mary and probably Scylla through that rape, and Margaret had killed Mary to save her daughter from being raped by her own father when she reached puberty. Stone continued, becoming more explicit than most women would dare to be in public in 1856. The faded faces tell the tale of 1,000 wrongs done by those who have the power and the opportunity to inflict them. Who shall say that a mother who witnesses the life of degradation to which her daughters are doomed has no right to rescue them by death from such a fate? The courtroom erupted. Pro-slavery observers shouted that Stone was slandering Archibald Gaines, that she had no proof of her accusations, that she was using abolitionist propaganda to defame a respectable Kentucky gentleman. Abolitionist observers cheered Stone's courage in speaking truth that society wanted silenced. Commissioner Pendary banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, while the crowd outside pressed against the courthouse doors, demanding to know what was happening inside. Frances Chambers attempted to discredit Stone by claiming she had tried to give Margaret a knife during jail visits, an allegation that Stone hotly denied and that was never substantiated. But the damage to Gaines's reputation was done. Stone had publicly accused him of raping his slave and fathering children on her, and she had done so in a courtroom packed with reporters who would carry her words to newspapers across the nation. Margaret herself testified during the hearing, which was extraordinary because fugitive slave laws explicitly prohibited alleged fugitives from testifying on their own behalf. But Commissioner Pendary, recognizing the exceptional nature of the case and the murder charges that complicated the proceedings, allowed Margaret to speak. Margaret's testimony was brief but devastating. When asked why she had killed her daughter, Margaret answered directly. She would rather kill her children than see them returned to slavery. When questioned about the scars on her face, Margaret described beatings she had endured at Maplewood. When asked about her children's light complexions, Margaret's answers left no doubt about Archibald Gaines's paternity, though Victorian decorum prevented explicit discussion of rape in court. Most remarkably, Margaret expressed no remorse. She testified that she wished she had succeeded in killing all her children before the Marshals stopped her, that she believed death was better than slavery for her babies, that Mary was at peace now rather than facing the degradation that awaited her at Maplewood. She stated clearly that if given another opportunity, she would do the same thing again. She expressed no sorrow for killing Mary, only regret that she had not completed the task of killing all 4 children. This testimony shocked even the abolitionists who supported her. Victorian society expected mothers to express grief and remorse for any harm to their children. Margaret's lack of regret seemed inhuman to observers who could not comprehend the absolute certainty with which she viewed her daughter's future under slavery. But Margaret was not performing for the courtroom's expectations. She was telling the truth. She had killed Mary out of love, and she would do it again because love demanded protection, even when protection required death. The prosecution used Margaret's statements as evidence of her dangerous nature. Francis Chambers argued that a woman who could kill her own child without remorse was clearly unfit for freedom, that her actions proved enslaved people needed white control for society's safety, that returning her to Archibald Gaines' authority was necessary to prevent further violence. But John Jolliffe turned Margaret's testimony into an indictment of slavery itself. He argued that any system that drove mothers to kill their children must be fundamentally evil, that Margaret's lack of remorse proved she believed death was genuinely better than slavery, that her certainty about Mary's future under Gaines demonstrated truths about slavery that white society preferred not to acknowledge. The trial stretched into its 3rd week as Commissioner Pendery heard additional testimony about life at Maplewood, about the light complexions of Margaret's younger children, about the scars on her face. The Cincinnati Enquirer, the Cincinnati Columbian, and the Cincinnati Daily Gazette provided extensive daily coverage. Newspapers across the nation reported on the case. Margaret Garner became the most famous fugitive slave in America, her story debated in parlors and churches and political meetings from Maine to Georgia. On February 26, 1856, after 4 weeks of testimony and 2 additional weeks of deliberation, Commissioner Pendery issued his ruling. Federal fugitive slave law took precedence over state criminal prosecution. The Fugitive Slave Act gave federal commissioners jurisdiction over escaped slaves, and that jurisdiction superseded Ohio's authority to prosecute Margaret for murder. Pendery rejected all the defense's arguments. The prior residence claim failed because Margaret had voluntarily returned to Kentucky after any visits to Ohio. The religious freedom argument against the Fugitive Slave Act was without legal merit, and state murder charges could not interfere with federal authority to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Margaret Garner, Robert Garner, and their 3 surviving children were to be returned to Archibald Gaines as his property. Tom and Sam, bearing scars from their mother's knife, would grow up enslaved. Infant Scylla would face the same future her murdered sister had been spared, and Margaret would return to Gaines's plantation, to his bed, to the life of sexual servitude that had driven her to infanticide. Ohio authorities immediately sought an extradition warrant to bring Margaret back to face murder charges after she was returned to Kentucky. The strategy was clever. Technically comply with federal law by returning the fugitives, then use state extradition law to bring Margaret back to Ohio for trial. But Archibald Gaines understood this game and moved quickly to prevent it. Immediately after Pendery's decision, Gaines took custody of the Garner family and began moving them between locations to prevent Ohio officials from serving extradition papers. He moved them from Cincinnati to Covington, Kentucky. When Ohio officials tracked them there, he had already transported them to Frankfort. When officials caught up to him in Frankfort, he moved them to Louisville. And when Ohio authorities located them in Louisville, Gaines put the family aboard the steamboat Henry Lewis bound for Arkansas. On March 6, 1856, the Henry Lewis departed Louisville, carrying Margaret, Robert, Tom, Sam, infant Scylla, and approximately 60 other enslaved people that Gaines was sending to his brother's plantation in Arkansas. Gaines was selling the Garner family south to remove them from the public spotlight and end the legal complications their case had created. For Margaret, the journey meant separation from whatever small community connections she had maintained in Kentucky, exile to unfamiliar territory, and the final death of any hope for freedom. Somewhere between Louisville and the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, disaster struck. The Henry Lewis collided with another steamboat, the Edward Howard. The collision was severe. Both vessels were damaged. Passengers were thrown about violently. Chaos erupted as people tried to understand what had happened and whether the boats were sinking. In the confusion, infant Scylla went overboard and drowned in the cold river water. Whether Margaret threw her daughter into the river deliberately or whether the collision threw them both overboard accidentally remains disputed. The abolitionist newspaper The Liberator reported that Margaret had deliberately thrown Scylla overboard and then jumped in herself, attempting to complete the infanticide she had begun in Cincinnati. Other accounts claimed the collision threw them overboard by accident. Margaret was pulled from the river and revived. Multiple witnesses reported that, when she regained consciousness and learned that Scylla had drowned, Margaret expressed what they called frantic joy. She declared that at least one more of her children was free from slavery now, that Scylla was with Mary, that death had saved them both from the degradation that awaited enslaved girls. Whether Scylla's death was murder or accident, the result was the same. 2 of Margaret's 4 children were dead within 2 months, and Margaret had either caused or welcomed both deaths as preferable to slavery. The drowning meant that Mary and Scylla would never know sexual abuse, would never bear their master's children, would never face the particular horrors that light-skinned enslaved girls endured. They were dead, but they were also free in the only way that mattered to their mother. The Henry Lewis continued to Arkansas with its surviving cargo of enslaved people. Margaret, Robert, Tom, and Sam reached Judge DeWitt Clinton Bonham's plantation at Tennessee, Landing, Mississippi. Gaines had apparently decided to send them to Mississippi rather than Arkansas, possibly selling them to Bonham, or possibly arranging for Bonham to hold them away from public attention. From March 1856 until her death in 1850, Margaret disappears almost completely from historical records. No letters document her experiences. No newspaper accounts track her movements. The woman whose trial had been national news vanished into the anonymity that characterized millions of enslaved people's lives. We do not know what labor she performed, what punishments she endured, whether Bonham sexually exploited her as Gaines had done, whether she was able to maintain any connection with Robert and her surviving sons. We know only that in 1858, approximately 2 years after arriving in Mississippi, Margaret Garner died. The official cause of death was typhoid fever, a disease that killed thousands in the Mississippi Delta region during epidemics that swept through communities lacking sanitation and medical care. Margaret was approximately 24 years old. Some historians have questioned whether typhoid was the actual cause of death, noting the convenient timing that removed a potentially embarrassing reminder of the Gaines family's scandal. But typhoid fever was genuinely common, and Margaret's death from disease requires no conspiracy theory. The simple truth that enslaved people died from preventable illnesses at catastrophic rates is sufficient explanation. There is another possibility that cannot be proven, but cannot be dismissed, that Margaret took her own life. She had tried to kill herself along with her children when the Marshals broke into Kite's house. She had expressed repeatedly that she preferred death to slavery. If she found herself back in bondage, separated from her murdered daughters, facing continued sexual abuse on a Mississippi plantation, suicide would have been a final assertion of control. But if Margaret did kill herself, no record documents it. She died, and she was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Mississippi, and that is all history can say with certainty. Robert Garner survived the war, years, and the abolition of slavery. In 1870, a reporter from the Cincinnati Chronicle found Robert and interviewed him about his experiences. Robert provided details about what had happened after the trial, the sale to Mississippi, Margaret's death from typhoid, his own survival through the war. He reported that before she died, Margaret had made him promise to never marry again in slavery, but to live in hope of freedom. That promise testified to Margaret's absolute conviction that slavery made authentic family life impossible. She had experienced the destruction of family bonds through sexual abuse, forced separation, the killing of her own children, and sale to distant locations. Her final request to Robert was that he refuse to create new family bonds under slavery's conditions, that he wait for genuine freedom before attempting to build a life with another person. Robert honored that promise. He did not remarry until after emancipation. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Robert began a new life as a free man. His subsequent history is lost to time, but he survived long enough to tell Margaret's story to that of Porter in 1870, ensuring that some record of her experiences would be preserved. For over a century after Margaret's death, her story faded from mainstream American memory. Historians who studied the fugitive slave era knew about the case, and abolitionists who had followed the trial passed down accounts to their descendants. But Margaret's story was too uncomfortable, too morally complex, too challenging to fit into the simplified narratives that post-Civil War America preferred about slavery and its abolition. Then, in 1987, 129 years after Margaret died, novelist Toni Morrison published Beloved, a work of fiction that reimagined Margaret's experience through the character of Seth, an escaped slave who kills her infant daughter rather than allow her to be returned to slavery. Morrison had encountered Margaret's story years earlier while editing The Black Book, a compendium of African American history. A newspaper clipping about the 1856 infanticide captured Morrison's imagination and became the foundation for her most celebrated novel. Beloved is not historical biography. Morrison changed names, locations, and many details to create literary fiction rather than documentary. But the emotional core came directly from Margaret, a mother's desperate choice to kill her child rather than see her enslaved, the trauma that followed that choice, the ways that violence and loss haunted survivors long after physical escape from bondage. Morrison's novel won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1988. It was adapted into a film starring Oprah Winfrey in 1998. It became required reading in schools and universities across America. And it permanently associated Margaret Garner's name with questions about trauma, memory, maternal love under oppression, and slavery's lasting psychological effects. Beloved sparked renewed scholarly interest in the historical Margaret Garner. Historian Nikki M. Taylor conducted extensive archival research, producing Driven Toward Madness, The Fugitive Slave, Margaret Garner, and Tragedy on the Ohio In 2016, Taylor documented the sexual abuse Margaret endured, traced the family's movements after trial, and provided the most complete historical reconstruction available. The novel also generated debate about the ethics of using real tragedy as artistic material, about whether fictional treatment of historical suffering risks exploiting victims' pain for entertainment. Morrison addressed these concerns by emphasizing that Beloved was not really about Margaret Garner specifically, but about the broader experience of enslaved mothers who faced impossible choices about their children's futures. Contemporary discussions about Margaret often focus on the moral question that Lucy Stone raised in 1856, whether a mother has the right to kill her child to save that child from future suffering. Some scholars argue that Margaret's infanticide was an assertion of agency, a refusal to accept powerlessness that slavery imposed. This interpretation sees Margaret as a tragic hero who exercised the only form of control she had left. Other scholars are more ambivalent, acknowledging the impossible circumstances that drove Margaret's action while refusing to romanticize child murder. These historians emphasize that Margaret was destroyed by slavery, that her action was not heroic resistance, but evidence of how completely slavery broke human beings. A third interpretation questions whether we should valorize infanticide, even when we understand the circumstances. Some ethicists argue that emphasizing Margaret's agency in killing her child risks normalizing violence against children by mothers in desperate circumstances. What remains undeniable is what Margaret's story reveals about slavery's comprehensive evil. The institution was not simply economic exploitation or physical brutality. It was a system that gave some human beings absolute power over others' bodies, families, and futures. It was a system that made rape legal when the victim was property, that intentionally destroyed family bonds through sale and separation, and that was so comprehensively cruel that mothers could rationally conclude their children were better off dead than enslaved. Margaret Garner lived only 24 years, all of them in slavery. She experienced freedom for 6 hours, from crossing the frozen Ohio River to being captured in Kite's house. In those 6 hours, she imagined a future for her children that her years of slavery had taught her was impossible. When that hope was destroyed, she made a choice that protected her daughter in the only way left available. The blood on the floor of Kite's house, Mary Garner's small body with her throat cut, Margaret covered in her child's blood, declaring she wished she had killed them all. These images shocked the nation in 1856 and should still shock us today. Not because Margaret was a monster, but because the system that drove her to such an act was monstrous. Not because infanticide should be celebrated, but because the circumstances that made infanticide appear to be mercy reveal evil so profound it defies comprehension. Margaret Garner's story has no comfortable ending, no redemptive message, no triumph that erases tragedy. It is simply the truth about what slavery did to families, to mothers, to children, to everyone it touched. And that truth demands to be told, remembered, and confronted by every generation of Americans who must reckon with a past that shaped the present in ways we are still struggling to understand.